Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Preventing Petya and Other Types of Ransomware with independent IT and security expert Russell Smith. You are also joined by BeyondTrust product manager Jason Silva, who will run through an overview and potentially a brief demo of PowerBroker for Windows towards the end of the webinar, so please stick around for that. My name is Sarah, your webinar host today, and I'd like to remind you to please submit your questions via the GoToMeeting console anytime throughout the webinar, and we'll cover your questions at the end during our Q&A time. So anytime you have a question, just pop it on in, and I will be monitoring those throughout. Also, today's session is being recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the recording and the slides shown here today within 2 business days from now. So now that that's all out of the way, I'd like to hand it on over to Russell, who will jump right in. Hello, Russell. Welcome. We're excited for you to be here with us, and let's talk about some ransomware.
Thanks, Sarah, for the introduction, and welcome to today's session on ransomware. But first, a little bit about me. So my name is Russell Smith, and I'm an independent IT consultant, and I specialize in everything Windows and server security. You can find a lot of blogging by me over at the Petya IT knowledge base, usually a couple of times a week. And if you're specifically interested in security, I've also got a lot of archive articles over at the Windows IT Professional website. I'm a trainer for Pluralsight. You'll find a couple of interesting Azure courses there, and I blog for Netrix on a regular basis. And if you'd like to get the latest information from me, please feel free to follow me there on Twitter. I've also got a book out at the moment, which is dedicated to the subject of least privilege security. Not just the technical problems that you might face, but also dealing with the political challenges of implementing a least privilege project. So if you want more information about that, head over to the publisher's website. Okay, so today's subject is ransomware. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about what ransomware is, because I think everybody who's on this call is probably aware. Especially this year, we've already had 2 major attacks, WannaCry and Petya. Petya being a variant of the WannaCry ransomware. So basically, ransomware, of course, is a kind of malware that steals your files and demands money back in order for you to get access to those files. So what I want to do is, before I talk about preventative measures, I just want to have a little look at how the WannaCry malware actually works. So there are basically a couple of different phases to the attack. And the first part of the attack is that somewhere, whether it's on the internet or on your corporate network, a computer has to become infected. And that is done using a JavaScript dropper. So it's a small piece of code that when a user browses to a particular link, gets run on their computer. Now, how do they get to that link? Well, that could be through social engineering. You trick the user into clicking the link, and then their machine gets infected with that piece of code. Now, once the code is there, it uses a vulnerability in the server message block protocol, which is used for file sharing on Windows networks. And it searches for other devices on the network with the SMB ports, which is TCP 445 open. So it looks for devices with that port open. And it can do that from the internet, or it can do that from within inside your corporate network. So once it's found those devices, it then uses a vulnerability to send a custom SMB session request to those devices. Now, what's interesting about this particular vulnerability, which is called Eternal Blue, that's its nickname if you like, is that Microsoft patched it a couple of months before the WannaCry virus hit. So if your machines were actually patched, you were already safe from WannaCry and Petya. But of course, that wasn't necessarily the case, that many organizations delay considerably installing patches. If you had Windows 10, then probably you were already protected because the updating system is different, of course, from Windows 7. So once those machines have been detected and they found devices that are vulnerable, then they are able to inject another piece of code into the SMB system process. And this is basically a Trojan called double pulsar, which basically allows the hacker to do anything they want on those infected machines. Okay, so whether that be encrypting files or doing absolutely whatever they want, because it runs in kernel mode. Now, of course, what's particularly devastating about WannaCry and Petya is that it self-propagates. Okay, so it's able to search for other devices. It finds that SMB vulnerability. It installs the double pulsar payload, and then it keeps searching and searching and propagating until every machine on your network, if they haven't been patched, is infected. Okay, so that's the second attack phase, if you like. So what does it do once it's gained control? So the first thing that it does is it deletes any shadow copies on the device. Why does it do that? Because if it's going to demand money for you to get access to your files, it needs to make sure that you don't have any copies of the files on your device. So it deletes all of the shadow copies, and then it encrypts all your files. Okay, and you get a pop-up message saying, well, sorry, all your files are now inaccessible, and if you want access to them, you've got to hand over X amount of money. So that's a basic overview of how WannaCry works. It's pretty scary stuff, but as you can understand from this outline, it's quite easily preventable. So, what about preventing malware? Okay, so I'm going to give you several points about how you can prevent this kind of attack. So the first point is that you should block unsigned scripts and macros. So I said at the very beginning is that how does a machine initially get infected with something like WannaCry? Well, these JavaScript droppers are a favorite way now of hackers to infect machines. But if you restrict your machines to only running scripts that you trust, then that JavaScript dropper cannot run in the first place. The reason that I've mentioned macros as well here is that Office macros are, again, one of the most popular ways that a hacker can get a malicious piece of code onto your devices. Okay, and I'll talk a bit more about that in detail as we go forwards. Least privilege security. So you need to make sure that, for instance, your users are not logging on with local administrator rights. You don't want to give the hacker full access to your devices right from the get-go. And you need to pay special attention that you're not using domain administrator accounts on anything but domain controllers. Because otherwise, if the hacker gets control of a device, he might be able to steal passwords, password hashes, and log on to very sensitive systems in your organization. Of course, patching vulnerabilities in time. If you'd patched against this eternal blue exploit, you wouldn't have had this problem in the first place. Another thing that you can do is disable legacy protocols like SMB version 1. Okay, Microsoft, again, before the WannaCry ransomware became prevalent, were already advising that organizations should basically disable SMB v1 if they're not using it. And finally, and I hope that for everybody on this call, this shouldn't even be an issue, of course, you should definitely have all inbound internet access blocked to your corporate intranet. and of course that should include TCP port 445. I just want to go back quickly to the least privilege scenario there that you can see on the screen. It also says security best practices. So of course that is things, again, as I mentioned, like not logging on to workstations with domain administrator accounts, applying Microsoft's security baseline standards as well to all of your devices. Okay, so let's start with the first point in a little bit more detail. So blocking unsigned scripts and macros. So how can you block unsigned and untrusted scripts? Well, you can turn on AppBlocker script rules, okay? And another advantage of turning on AppBlocker script rules is that you automatically put PowerShell into constrained language mode. And basically what that means is that if a hacker gets access to a device, he's very limited to what he can do with PowerShell, okay? Because it doesn't have full language mode available to that hacker, okay? And of course, as I mentioned, I recommend that you disable macros and VBA apps in Microsoft Office for users that don't need them. And that will be the majority of users in your organization. But what else? Understand the difference between what I like to call locks and seatbelts. And again, I'll explain a little bit more about this as we go forwards. But there are some settings in Windows and Office which are controls that stop users doing things. And there are other settings which are just seatbelts, which prevent them from doing things hastily, okay? Kind of a, are you really sure you want to do this? But ultimately, if the user decides to do something, it lets them do it, okay? And you should very clearly understand the difference between those two things. I also mentioned AppBlocker back there for blocking untrusted scripts. If you do have Windows 10 on your network already, then you should also think about using Device Guard, which again is application control like AppBlocker, but it's less susceptible to being turned off by people with administrative privileges. So it's much higher, it gives a much higher level of assurance than AppBlocker does. Okay, so let's have a quick look then at macros specifically in Microsoft Office, because as well as the JavaScript dropper, this is another way that hackers can get their malicious code onto your devices. Now, you're probably familiar with this. This is protected view in Microsoft Office. So if you open a document which Windows deems to be from the internet, it will open basically in a sandbox. Okay, so you will not be able to edit content. Any active content in that document, any macros, will not be able to run. Okay, but this is a seatbelt. Okay, it's not a control. So the user can decide that they will enable editing if they want and take that document out of its sandbox. They can even go into the Trust Center and disable protected view if you haven't configured it otherwise. So I just want to bring your attention to the idea of seatbelts again. So I said that Windows determines the file has been downloaded from the internet, and it does that by using Internet Explorer zones. That's another subject we won't cover today, but that's how it works. And again, the user can decide, well, okay, I don't want to see that warning message, so I'm going to just unblock that file and decide that no, it wasn't actually downloaded from the internet. Okay, so the user can override that. There are another scenario where users can override that protection that's built into Windows and Office. Imagine that a user downloads a zip file from the internet, or it comes as an attachment in their email, for instance. It's marked as from an untrusted source by Windows. Now, if they extract the contents of that zip file using the built-in extractor in Windows, all the extracted files will retain that information that they were downloaded from the internet. But, and here's a big but, if you allow your users to install a third-party unzip application, and you can see here 7-zip, that may not necessarily be the case. If you unzip that file or extract those files using 7-zip, then the extracted files lose that marker to say that they were downloaded from the internet. So when they go to open those Office documents, they will not open in protected view because they are trusted. So those protections are lost. So it's very easy for users to either circumvent those protections, so take their seatbelts off, or to accidentally just take their seatbelt off without even realizing what it is that they're doing. Okay. So I talked a little bit about blocking macros. So we've got to the first point, which is the protected view and the sandbox. But if a document has active content, code inside it, then something else happens. Now, if you look at the screen, this is the Office Trust Center, and the default setting is disable all macros with notification. Now, it's really important to understand what that actually means. Does it mean that all macros are disabled and that users will get a message to say, well, the macro in this document is disabled, haha, you can't do anything about it? Or does it mean that this document will open with the macro disabled, but if you want, you can enable it? So I don't think it's too difficult to guess which one of those two things it actually means, but you should be sure about it. So if you have a look at the screen now, if you've ever opened a document with a macro in it that's considered untrusted by Office, this is what you will see with that default setting. So again, this is a seatbelt scenario that is designed to offer some protection, but at the end of the day, the user can enable that active content. So you're putting that security decision into the hands of your users at the end of the day, if they even read that message, because users have a tendency just to ignore security messages and click, click, click. They just want to get their work done. Okay. Now, I showed you the security center in the last, the trust center in the last slide, and the good news is that you can configure those settings using group policy. And of course, users, assuming they don't have administrative privileges, they can't override those settings. So, hopefully you can see on the screen there the different options you have in group policy for configuring those macro settings in the Trust Center. So the only way you can actually disable macros is to select disable all without notification, and they will open the documents, okay? And even if they disable protected view, they will just see the document without any active content. They won't even know that active content is there unless somebody has told them that there's active content in that document. Okay, and you can see there are various other options there. Of course, you can enable all macros, which is of course not recommended, and there's also the option to trust signed macros, which might be an option for your organization depending on how you use documents, of course. Now, apart from those settings, there's a new setting which Microsoft introduced into Office 2016 last year. And basically, what it does is allow you to disable macros in any documents that have been downloaded from the internet, and only allow them to run in locations which you consider to be trusted. So there's also that option as well. Now, I've talked a little bit about trusted locations, and again, this is important. So this is the default settings for the Trust Center, And you can see there that there are user locations and policy locations. And there are 3 user locations there by default. And the user can add to that if you don't configure group policy. And as an administrator, you can add your own corporate trusted locations. So, of course, that usually means network shares. And in group policy, you can say, well, no, I don't want users to be able to add trusted locations. Why? Because I don't trust my users to do that, to make that decision. But I might add some of my own corporate trusted locations. Now, of course, the problem with all of this and trusted locations is that, okay, you download a file from the internet, maybe it's okay because Windows kind of warns the user, well, you don't really want to run the active content, or will block that active content completely via group policy. But if the user is somehow able to copy that document into a trusted location, or a hacker is able to do that, or is able to trick the user into doing that, then suddenly that document will run with all of its active content. So if you are going to allow trusted locations in Office, you have to really plan how are you going to use them, and you have to secure them so that they're either very restricted to a certain set of users or a certain set of documents, but you really have to plan how you are going to enable users to securely run active content inside Office documents. And there's no easy answer. It's not an ideal solution that Microsoft have here, and it's always, of course, a balance between usability and security. Okay, so macros, I think, is really, really important to get a grip of that. I can't stress how important that is. Okay, so WannaCry, it actually didn't use macros, but it could have done. It was a perfectly valid way to get WannaCry onto your system in principle, one of the nasty things that it does. It used a piece of JavaScript code, and well, it would be great if you could stop that from running, okay? Now, in order to be infected with WannaCry, you didn't necessarily need to have that JavaScript code run on your device, but the original machine, maybe on your network or on the internet, was infected with that code. So it's still a good idea to try and stop it. And in App Blocker, you can enable script rules so that you basically only trust code from trusted locations that you define, or from trusted publishers. So it would have blocked that dropper code in its tracks. Okay, another way you could have blocked WannaCry is to basically make sure that SMB, internal blue vulnerability, was patched. Now, why was Windows 10 largely unaffected? Because, of course, the updating system in Windows 10 is completely different from Windows 7. So you have, as an organization, in principle, less control. Microsoft are forcing you basically to update. But it's not, you know, it's not all bad. That's not necessarily bad. There are, of course, reasons for that. And the great thing about Windows 10 is that it has Windows Update for Business. So if you needed to control updates in your organization before, pretty much it meant installing Windows Server Update services, and that was a fair chunk of infrastructure that you needed to install and manage. But now in Windows 10, Microsoft have given you a certain amount of control over how updates are installed just with a simple group policy setting. And those updates are downloaded from Microsoft. There's no need to install a server in your infrastructure. And you can basically stop updates from appearing if you want for so many months. So they also differentiate between upgrades and updates. So an upgrade is like from the anniversary update to the creators update. An update is what you receive maybe once or twice a month. And you can delay those if you want. Of course, the recommendation is to try and test as quickly as possible and not to delay the installation of those updates. Okay, I mentioned security best practices, and disabling legacy protocols like SMB version 1. Now, you can kill two birds with one stone here. You can get the Microsoft Security Baseline Group Policy Object backups from the Microsoft Compliance Toolkit. They're all in there. You just go and download it, extract them, using the built-in Windows extractor, of course. And all of those security recommendations that Microsoft wants you to use, they are packaged up for you in GPO backups. So you can test them very quickly by applying them to some test systems and then roll them out in your organization once they are validated. Now, included in those settings for the creators update was some registry keys to disable SMB version 1. Now, I say registry keys because they're not real group policy settings. So you have to be careful with these, that if you apply them, it's not so easy to roll them back. So you really must do your testing. It's also worth noting, if you have a look at the settings in the spreadsheet on the screen, you will see that the second setting that's highlighted, so configure SMB v1 client driver, is set to enabled, but then there are several options, and one of the options is to disable driver. Okay, so you must actually enable that setting and then set it to disable driver. Okay, so you don't want to disable that setting. So I just want to point that out. So within those latest baselines, you have the option to easily disable SMB version 1 across your fleet of devices. Okay. So that's obviously really important that you think about that as well. And the great thing about these baselines is that rather than having to think about hundreds and hundreds of different settings and how they should be configured, let Microsoft deal with it for you. Okay, and if you apply these settings, of course, if you apply them unchanged, Microsoft will still support your systems. It's not that you've set some weird settings and you've gone against their recommendations. No, use their settings. If you need to deviate from them, then try to make a separate group policy object to do that. But these settings, try to apply them in your environment and you will be much more secure for it. Okay, so the last thing, but definitely not the least, but it is least privilege and security best practices. So, of course, a lot of these settings and controls that I've mentioned, they can be overridden if your users have administrative rights, okay? Or the hacker can get the same rights as your logged on user and override any protections you put in place. So it's all fairly useless if you're not going to apply the principle of least privilege. Please, please, please think about how you're using your domain administrator accounts. They should be restricted to domain controllers only. Now, hackers, they love to be able to move and hop from one machine to another. And how do they do that? Either using something like the SMB vulnerability, which I've just talked about, or they do that using credentials that have either logged onto a set of different machines or credentials that are the same across all of your machines. So please don't set the local administrator password on all of your machines to be the same. Okay, it's a fatal mistake. Okay, because once that password has been compromised, your entire network's been compromised. And there's a tool which allows you to randomize those passwords on each device, store it securely in Active Directory, okay, and you will have a great defense against lateral movement on your network. So I've already talked about applying those security baselines. So download the Security Compliance Toolkit, have a look at that and test it out. Please don't let any old script run on your systems, and I recommend just disabling Office macros. And you pull away those users who do need to use them, and you work out a way that will allow them to use macros. Everybody else, just disable them. Application control. So I spoke about app blocker and blocking scripts. Well, you can go another step further, not just block scripts, but block any untrusted executables, Windows installer files, packaged applications from the Windows Store, whatever you want. And of course, you can look at App Blocker and Device Guard to do those two things. And Credential Guard, okay, is also new in Windows 10. Basically, this uses virtualization-based security to protect privileged credentials on the network. So if a domain administrator does, for instance, log on to a workstation, their token, their Kerberos token, will be protected in a virtual machine, making it much, much harder for a hacker to get hold of that token and abuse it. And of course, software updates. You need to make sure that the OS is up to date, and of course, the applications on your network, Office, of course, any other applications that you have, maybe Adobe Acrobat Reader, of course, needs to be updated on a regular basis. And of course, I haven't written it on the slide here, but I think, and I hope that it goes without saying, that all of the kind of usual security defenses that we expect to see, like antivirus, endpoint firewalls, which you've got built into Windows anyway, you should make sure that those things are enabled. So I hope that gives you an idea of how WannaCry and Petya worked and the things that you could do to stop them in their tracks. Okay, so now I'm going to hand over to Jason, who's going to talk about PowerBroker.
All right, thank you very much. Let me just make sure I'm sharing the right screen. This should be the right screen. And just as peace of mind, if you just let me know, you should see a Beyond Insight sort of logo.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so let me share out a couple of slides. I only have too many slides. It's really just to kind of set the stage. And again, as always, thank you. Always very kind of informative. Make sure I get the right thing. All right, perfect. So PowerBroker for Windows. So if it wasn't kind of obvious from going through all of that, there's a lot of little things that kind of help with preventing malware and ransomware and all this kind of thing. And there really isn't one thing, one magic bullet that you can do to make yourself protected. And one of the things that was discussed was this concept of least privilege. And in a nutshell, really what it's about is saying, look, my users log onto these boxes, and a lot of times, a lot of companies we deal with, they're still administrators because there's a couple of applications or a couple of duties in their role that needed elevated or admin rights. So it was just easier to make the person themselves the administrator. We hear it all the time, but they don't really have to be. If it's the applications that need administrative rights, let's give the application those administrative rights, but have the users log on as a least privilege, or rather a standard non-admin user. Or the other way, maybe you've actually gone and you've said, look, all my users are already administrative rights, I don't need you. There's still a lot that goes on. There's time spent in just dealing with applications that come around, trying to work out all the different registry keys or the file hacks that you need to do to make that application work, even though the user's a standard user. There's a lot of logging that can be done. We still need to understand what these people are doing. There's, vulnerable software that's out there, or the idea around this, if that SMB version 1 is enabled, you may not want certain policies to take effect, or you might want a stricter set of policies to take effect. We can track all of that. So basically, it's an application-focused tool, whether it be on a client or an actual server. Some information about kind of what it really is. Again, I kind of mentioned a little bit of this. Again, I don't like talking too much about these. It is patented. We go through just what's called asset discovery. What machines or what devices even touch my network, even if they're not Windows-based devices. It could be just networking equipment. It could be rogue software that's touching your network. Part of the software sort of allows this wider breadth of a scanning. App control, straight up, blacklist, whitelisting kind of things. I mentioned too, you may want to allow an application with elevation. Monitoring the file system itself, so file integrity monitoring. Again, another big piece of this. You may just want to say, look, if Outlook or Office is where a lot of this ransomware comes from, let's not allow these Office applications to write data to certain locations. Well, we can do that as well, right? But what I want to do is sort of go through A quick little sort of show and tell about what the software is. What you're looking at here is the reporting piece. I wanted to make sure that I was at least logged in there. What you see is a group policy object. If you're familiar with group policy, you've seen this kind of stuff before. And if you are, you've probably used group policy preferences. Well, then you've already used our software, our technology, right? Because Microsoft actually purchased what group policy preferences is today, from us back in 2006. We spun off and formed this company called Beyond Trust and changed the name of what PowerBroker Windows, used to be to, of course, what it is today. I'm just happen to use this method here. Basically, what I want is, here's what these users can do, or here's what any user on these computers can do, and here's what they can't do. I want to be in control of what's allowed for my users. Not to the point where I'm Big Brother. We're not looking to get that, but I really do want to, help my users protect themselves. I want to keep the company out of the paper, kind of thing. So if I go over to the box here, it happens to be a Windows 8 machine. I'm going to run something like data sources, right? And I can see, as simple as this application is, even if you choose not to use this particular application, it's an application that requires elevated rights. I opened it just fine, but then I tried to get into it, and I find out, oh, look at that. It's one of those things that this is why my users keep telling me they need to be admins. Again, they don't need to be admins. It's just an application. It has security behind it. I'm going to allow the software, this PowerBroker Windows software, to tweak the permissions, the security behind this application, but make sure that the logged on user still owns the application, right? So, kind of compartmentalizing the applications, what can touch what kind of thing. And then if I open this Retina application, again, it's just another application that happens to be on this machine that requires administrative access. So I'll go ahead and I'll do that, right? I'm going to go back over to that set of policies there. I already have a rule that talks about this data source config, and all it is it's a trigger point. I know that on some of my machines, and I can filter it to only apply to certain people if I want, but if this application runs on the machines that are targeted or the users that are targeted, and I'm doing a publish rule here, then I want something to happen. That something in this case is quite simple. Give that application the same security rights that the administrative security group has. Doesn't have to be that group. I'm just making it easy here for a quick show and tell kind of thing. But basically what I've done is I'm going to make the application the administrator, not the user. So this rule's all done. It's all set to go. I just turned it on. The fact that I'm using our group policy mode, right? I just got to run a quick GP update. We could also do this completely outside of AD, or we can do this within a McAfee EPO framework, right? It doesn't really matter the method that you choose to use, whatever method's going to work best for you. I'm just using group policy here. So my computer policy is updated. In a second here, my user policy is updated. I run the same application. I'm running this application as that same logged on user, but now it works, right? And again, I know it's a simple application, but it could have been an installer. It could have been ActiveX Control that needed to install. It could have been iTunes that needed to update, or Adobe Reader that needed to update. Whatever the thing is that is been sort of the standing factor for why your users are admins in the first place, we can address it with a rule. Right? And we can get into deep on a one-on-one on what kind of rules are really available and all the little ins and outs of the software. But at a high level, that's all I've really done. And for those applications, like that data source one that I already had a rule ready to go, that's okay. I don't have to know everything that's actually already happening on these machines because it's reporting up to me. I know what my users are doing. So I know that I applied a rule to ODBC. In a moment here, so long as the lab wants to cooperate a little bit, but in a moment, I'll know that when I tried to run that Retina application, UAC prompted for it. And whether or not, whatever kind of application it was, I can just tell the software, make me a rule for that. Make me the same kind of rule I just showed you that I have for that data source config. I want a very similar rule that targets this application because I know that my users are running those applications. I know they require administrative access, so I want to keep that going from here on. I don't want them being hit by the UAC prompt. I don't, or some kind of other message. Maybe you're not using UAC. In some way, they would be stopped because it would tell them they don't have the proper rights to do it. The idea is that they run a smooth day, whatever it is that their job requires, let that happen. And if I want to jump back here real quick, if I wanted to, not make my users have to wait for me to go in and actually make policy that says, I know this application requires administrative access, therefore I'll give you a rule that does that. I can give them a rule that allows them to do it themselves on a one-to-one basis. So I just right-clicked and I said, look, I need this application to run in an elevated state. Whether or not I wanted to put a message in front of that says, sure, I'll let you do this. I just need to make sure that you are the human being I think you are, whether by their AD credentials, radius, whatever it might be. I've just let this thing kind of go through. And then this kind of event will come up as well. I'll know when applications are running that require administrative rights, so I know what rules to make. And more importantly, I'll know which ones are really important because my users went through the extra sort of 1-2 click thing to right click on and say, I need this thing elevated right now. It's completely up to you if you allow that, but it's a very useful sort of in the beginning stages of this kind of rollout. Least privilege is not this sort of holy grail that I'll never find kind of thing. It's really a doable thing, but you do need a tool to help you in that. And in PowerBroker Windows sort of is that tool, right? So that application came up. But now what about applications that we say, look, Adobe Reader, we can all joke about it, but it is a very important, a very common application that's on just about everyone's system. We also know that Adobe Reader and Java and Firefox and Chrome and IE, these tend to become exploited. They become vulnerable applications. Well, again, as a company beyond trust, we know what applications have what vulnerabilities. We know how they rate as far as their risk severity. Will allow you to build policy inside PowerBroker for Windows that feeds off of that data. So when I go and I run Adobe Reader, I don't let it run. The rule that puts up this message, and that message is customizable, by the way, but the rule that put up this message simply stated, look, if my user runs Adobe Reader or some version of it that has sort of a high risk, severity, and maybe it's 30 days or 60 days or 90 days old, at that point, I need you to block it, right? I could have just set a policy that says, you don't have to let them know. Go ahead and let it run passively. Don't elevate it. Just allow it to run. But I need to know. I need an event being reported up into this Beyond Insight that comes with PowerBroker for Windows. So I know that for whatever reason, these applications aren't hitting the patch cycle. That's why I say maybe you do it after 30 days or 60 days kind of thing. So again, essentially, I just want to show this kind of thing. I'm totally logged in as a standard user. There are applications that as a standard user, I need to run that require administrative access. That's okay. I'm going to target those applications, not give these admin rights to the user. One of the dangerous things we see all the time is companies have a process where they give users, and you can't see me, but I have air quotes, temporary admin rights. Oftentimes I see those temporary admin rights becoming permanent because there's no process in place to remove them, or in the time that the user had those admin rights, they've gone in and they've created themselves another user that's an admin. So they'll always have an admin user. We don't want that. We don't need that. What we need is applications to run with just enough rights that they require to run properly. Again, all the while we're tracking to see, are these applications that would otherwise have been trusted, are they in an untrusted state? Do they have a vulnerability? Do they have malware? Do we know about this kind of thing? And we'll report this all to you, again, to help you make better decisions on what kind of policies you would need. So kind of a high level. Hope that makes sense. I do want to leave some time as well. Let me go back to the slides here and go here. I did that piece. So what we want to do is, and Sarah, I believe you have a little poll that you'd like to do, like to put up. If I can answer any questions, of course, or if Russ can answer any questions, happy to do so.
Thank you so much, Jason. Okay, guys, let's jump into our last poll. Would you be interested in engaging with one of our security experts further? We would love to chat or walk you through a more thorough one-on-one demo of PowerBroker for Windows or one of our other PowerBroker products or even Retina. So let us know, select yes. Somebody will be in contact with you if you do select yes to set up your one-on-one demo. So I'm going to leave this up. Let's dive into a couple of questions. Russell, a couple came in for you here. So how would you block unsigned scripts and macros?
How would you block them? Well, using application control. So there's built-in application control called App Blocker in Windows 7, and you can use that to restrict scripts running that are located only in trusted locations or signed by trusted publishers. In Windows 10, there is also Device Locker, which is also basically application control but runs with a higher level of trust. And blocking macros, well, you need to do that with the group policy office settings, so you configure the trust center to disable macros without notification.
Russell, what is the impact of disabling SMB v1?
Well, that depends on your network. Of course, there are some devices, some applications maybe that use SMB1, which is why Microsoft are only getting around to disabling it kind of now, really. The next version of Windows 10, if it's a clean install, will have SMB version 1 disabled out of the box. And it'll be completely disabled in Enterprise Edition, both the client and the server. But actually, the only way you can really understand do you need it or not is to test on a couple of machines all your applications and all your devices. Do they still work? Unfortunately.
Jason, this came in for you. What PBW rule or mechanism did you use for the quote-unquote request authorization feature?
Oh, sure. It's technically called the shell rule because it literally extends the Windows shell, right? So it allows that when I right-clicked on that application or an installer to have my request authorization text in there. By the way, you can actually put whatever text you want. By default, it's run elevated for things like EXEs and install elevated for MSI kind of applications. But it's called the shell rule. It's one of the built-in types of rules in PowerBroker for Windows.
Another one for you, Jason.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
If I may, the question about SMB. So the other thing, and it's tough to get into in a short time frame, but I mentioned that there are ways to sort of filter out which rules apply in which situations. Well, one of those situations happens to be based on registry values. So you can evaluate whether or not SMB version 1 is actually enabled. And if it is, your rules can reflect that. So you may force an application to run with only standard user rights, for instance, or maybe that's when you want to deny certain applications, highly sensitive, highly critical applications. Maybe you don't want them running at all on a machine that has SMB version 1 enabled. Well, that's okay, right? You have all these elevate, demote, deny kind of activities that you can do with the software based on, simple things like who am I or what groups do I belong to, or other things like do certain files exist? Are there certain registry entries in place? So I just wanted to get that out there as well.
Yeah, no worries. I have another question for you too. So how does PowerBroker behave when a computer is rebooted in safe mode, whether with or without networking?
We won't actually be enabled. We're considered a non-essential service, right? So we won't be available in safe mode.
Okay, let's see. I think this might be for Russell, but maybe Jason has some input too. How does a large company handle developers who use numerous different apps that require admin rights? It may be too cumbersome to elevate each and every application. Would assigning quote unquote power user rights be a good option?
I don't think power user rights really. It's basically an administrator. I think is a quick answer to that. So assigning power user rights isn't going to give you any real protection. I don't know what Jason thinks about it, but of course one option for developers is to give them a virtual machine that they use for standard business processes like email, documents, and whatever, and then they have another device or the physical host for their development tasks. I mean, that's an option. for instance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if my giggle didn't give it away, I'm in full agreement with Russell on the whole idea around power users, because you are just essentially an admin at that point, and it's an easy escalation path to a full admin, right? So with developers, we're still going to make them a standard user when they log in. There are a core set of applications like Visual Studio, things like that, that we know exist, and we know in most cases require admin rights. So we'll provide rules for them for the things we can't account for. And I used to be a dev, right? You'll never fully lock down and walk away from a set of policy for a dev. So they tend to keep that shell rule, that ability to right click and elevate, say, a new installer. They want to install a codec. They want to install some kind of development suite. That's okay. We understand that. But all we're looking for is, would you pass an audit? Do your users log in? Well, I shouldn't say all we care about, obviously, but one of the things. If an auditor came in, and one of the things that's often coming up is, are your users able to log into their machines with admin rights? Well, no, they don't. We have an application that provides the necessary rights to targeted applications, but my users themselves are not. The other option is, and I kept saying how the default stance of PowerBroker for Windows is when we elevate an application, it's sort of in place, right? So the application is still running as the logged on user, but the application security token includes more than that user could have given it. Well, there's another way that we can do it where we literally do a run as. So your devs or your help desk would have rules applied to them that can launch an application as somebody else, somebody with real admin rights. But you won't ever see what those credentials are, because one of our other tools that you get a little bit of get a few licenses of that as well. We have another sort of password management tool. We'll let it cycle and manage the credentials for these privileged accounts, but we'll let PowerBroker for Windows use those accounts without telling the human being what those credentials are. So there are multiple ways to do that. But again, what Russell said there, that is an option that you do have, make Windows behave like CubeOS kind of thing with VMs.
Okay, time for one more question. Russell, in the beginning of the training, you listed 5 ways that ransomware can be prevented. Can you list them again, please?
Yes, just hang on 1 second. Just need to see my screen. Oh, I'll do it off the top of my head. Okay. So the first one was blocking unsigned scripts and macros. The second one was least privileged security and security best practices. The next one, I think, was disabling SMB version 1. What else did I have in there? The last one was making sure that...
I think it's up on the screen right now. I think Jason ran into it.
Oh, right, sorry, I don't see the screen. Hang on a second. 1 minute. Yep, good. Disabling SMB1 version 1, and of course the third one there was patching vulnerabilities. There you go.
And just to jump in on that question too, we will be sending you guys this PowerPoint so you can refer back to it and write down those 5 steps or 5 ways. You should also be able to see the document in the handout section right now, so you should be able to directly download it right now. Okay, great. Let's see if there's any more questions that came in. Okay, you're welcome, Austin. We're all set. Okay, guys, so we're gonna wrap this up here. Again, like I just mentioned, the presentation will be available within about 2 business days from now. And that will come to you via email with the email that you registered for the webinar with. So you will get the slides, you will get the recording, and all packaged up in one email, and it will come from our email alias communications@beyondtrust.com. So make sure that that email is whitelisted so you receive it, and then you can forward it on, you can rewatch, you can save the slides, whatever you'd like, and you'll have all of that in a couple business days from now. So thank you, Russell. Thank you, Jason. You guys rock it. I think this was a really great webinar, a lot of questions, and thanks to the audience. You guys are super engaged, and we really appreciate all of your questions coming in for our experts. So thank you for your time today and being present on our webinar, and we will see you guys at the next one. Take care, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sarah, as always, and Russell, thank you.